Israel's seizure of the Rafah Crossing worsens an already dire situation for 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. Their last gateway to the outside world now closed. Why has Israel defied the US over this, and what could the consequences be for all sides? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. Ignoring international opposition, including appeals from US President Joe Biden, Israeli troops have seized the Rafah Crossing in Gaza. More Palestinians have been killed in attacks on the area too, a place where Israel had ordered them to flee for safety. Just as the forced movement of people constitutes a war crime, another appears to be being committed by Israel in ordering Palestinians to now leave Rafah. Now, Israel's action tramples over years of carefully negotiated agreements on how to govern the crossing, the vital gateway for people and goods in and out of the Strip. So what does the seizure of Rafah mean for Gaza's Palestinians, who are now in even greater danger? And will there be consequences for Israel? We'll be asking our panel of guests these questions and more in just a few moments. But first, this report from Alexandra Byers.
Only hours after Hamas's acceptance of a ceasefire proposal, Israeli tanks rolled into Rafah, seizing the border crossing with Egypt and putting a chokehold on one of the Strip's last remaining lifelines.
The closure of the Rafah crossing has prevented the entry of trucks carrying medicine, medical equipment and fuel that is necessary for hospitals, and has prevented the departure of thousands of wounded people and patients who were waiting to travel.
As the tanks advanced, Israeli warplanes bombed densely packed homes, and Israel ordered 100,000 Palestinians to leave eastern Rafah, its war cabinet voting unanimously to continue military operations in the southern Gaza city. Nearly 1.5 million displaced civilians have sought safety there. Global condemnation was widespread and immediate.
Make no mistake, a full-scale assault on Rafah would be a human catastrophe. Countless more civilian casualties, countless more families forced to flee yet again.
Beyond the humanitarian fears, Israel's actions this week throw regional peace in the balance. The Israeli Prime Minister has repeatedly said the border and Philadelphia corridor, a narrow strip of land that serves as a buffer zone between Egypt and Gaza, were used for terrorist purposes and must be under Israel's control. But both Egypt and Hamas strongly oppose any Israeli occupation of the border. That would be a breach of long-standing treaties and agreements. The Egyptian parliament has warned such a move would be a grave risk and an indirect threat to Egypt. Alexandra Byers, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
The Rafah border crossing is Gaza's main transit point for people and goods, including humanitarian aid. It's governed by a complex set of agreements that Israel has now breached. It was established as a buffer zone under the Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty of 1979, based on the Camp David Accords. It lays out demilitarised zones and borders and limits the presence of Egypt's military in the Sinai Peninsula. Now, when Israel withdrew soldiers and settlers from Gaza in 2005, it signed the Philadelphia Accord with Egypt. That covered how the Rafah border crossing was to be run and allowed Egypt to deploy guards. Shortly after, Israel and the Palestinian Authority reached their own agreement on movement and access, outlining how they would jointly govern the Gaza side. Israel suspended the deal when Hamas came to power in 2007. Rafah has since been under the joint control of Egypt and Hamas in Gaza. Okay, let's bring in our guests now. In London, Salman Sheikh is a former UN official and founder of the peacebuilding organisation, the Sheikh Group. Nour Odeh is a political analyst and public diplomacy specialist who's with us from Ramallah. Also in London, A Hellyer is a senior associate fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you very much for being with us here on Inside Story. First of all, Salman, if I can begin with you, can you just give us your perspective on what you believe is happening in and around Rafah right now, specifically in regards to the crossing? Why is Israel there? What is it trying to achieve?
Well, I think it looks like the start of a rolling operation into Rafah. Yes, it could be diplomatic posturing to try and put more pressure on Hamas before any agreement comes to fruition. But I have my doubts. I am quite worried that with the pressure on Netanyahu delivering a total victory, as he says, and promising to go into Rafah, and with his cabinet, his right-wing extremist genocidal cabinet for some, breathing down his neck, that this so-called limited operation, which supposedly has not crossed any red lines of President Biden, will actually roll into something much bigger.
Nour, do you agree with that this is just the beginning of a rolling operation by Israel?
I fear that it may be, yes. And we've seen that happen in previous ground invasions during this war, where Netanyahu would downplay how long it might take, how extensive it is. And then we'd see those red lines and those parameters kind of extend and become a lot more elastic. So for now, there's some verbal, at least, pressure on Israel. There will be some maneuvering, but I fear that given the way the talks are going, the ground invasion in Rafah could escalate into something even more catastrophic than what we're seeing right now.
Yeah. AJ, can we just take a step back and give us a little bit of context here? Can you just explain why the Rafah Crossing is so important? Not only, before the war, before October the 7th, but especially since, because it was really the only crossing that wasn't completely controlled by Israel, wasn't it?
So thank you for the invitation. There are 7 land crossings from Gaza into, quote unquote, the rest of the outside world. 6 of them are completely and totally controlled by Israel. The 7th, which is Rafah, was partially controlled by Israel. And this is one of the reasons why international law and the international community has been so clear that Gaza is an occupied territory, because Israel maintains effective control over Gaza and has done since 1967, even after the withdrawal of troops in 2005. So I think that's important for us in terms of the framing here. When it comes to Rafah, because there was partial control, there was somewhat more leniency in terms of people moving through that border crossing, as well as aid. And when we look at how the Israeli government has been incredibly resistant to aid inflows through other border crossings, let alone people, in terms of people trying to flee the fighting and so on, I think it's a very poor indicator as to what we can expect going forward. Poor in the sense that I think that aid organizations are incredibly concerned about what this means for the flow of aid and for people leaving, especially for medical emergencies, keeping in mind that despite all of this talk around negotiations, and we've had the conversation now over the last few minutes about that, the fact of the matter is that Israeli media broke this story earlier today. Last week at Thursday's War Cabinet meeting, Benjamin Netanyahu proposed starting the military operation in Rafah, as he called it, as soon as possible. And he overrode the War Cabinet ministers and the professionals. A source with knowledge of the details at the meeting said everybody rejected it, but he overrode that. So I think that the notion that there's two parties here negotiating in good faith somehow is extremely erroneous. And I'm like Salman, I'm concerned that this could very easily escalate. The fact that it hasn't gotten worse thus far doesn't mean that there's been a decision to roll back. I think that there is a political calculation going on here that has nothing to do with security, that has nothing to do with the hostages, that frankly doesn't even really have much to do with Hamas, but has to do with Benjamin Netanyahu trying to ensure the continuation of his political standing as prime minister.
Yeah. Salman, if I can come to you now, obviously this is happening, as HA was outlining, in the context of ceasefire talks that have been on again and off again, growing pressure from the United States. Why do you think that After months and months of talking about this, Netanyahu has decided to go into Rafah and take control of the crossing now.
Because we didn't put guardrails on Benjamin Netanyahu pretty much from the first week after October the 7th, after those atrocities were committed. You know, I was in Lebanon in 2006 in that war, working for the UN, and it was pretty quick what the American administration did, even if that was a devastating war for some in Lebanon, that they, President Bush and Condi Rice, put guardrails on an Israeli cabinet which was shocked and in meltdown. Well, that didn't happen this time. And, you know, the Israelis have this notion of an hourglass. They think that there is sand that will eventually run out of. An hourglass is the moment when they have to kind of wrap up. Well, they must keep looking at that hourglass and seeing, and can't believe their luck, that the sand is still there. There really just hasn't been the kind of signalling that was necessary. And we're now 7 months plus on. Red lines, and remember, President Biden was part of a previous red line in Syria under the Obama administration, don't seem to carry the kind of weight that they should. And so Benjamin Netanyahu is doing what he needs to do to stay in power. Otherwise, he's between the hammer and the anvil. He either sees a collapse of his cabinet and he goes out into the political wilderness, perhaps to face prosecution, or he continues to fight and seek the ear of the international community. Well, for now, that's what he's choosing. And Rafa, I'm afraid, is getting now, as well as the rest of the Gazan people, the brunt of it.
Yeah, Palestinians in Gaza are paying the ultimate price day after day, as we have seen. Nour, Human Rights Watch has said with each day that Israeli authorities block life-saving aid, more Palestinians are at risk of dying. That really is at the heart of this issue, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, you know, to add to that, we have to remember that the 1.4 million people in Rafah right now have been enduring war, malnutrition, trauma for 7 months. So they're already spent. They're already fatigued. There's nothing left to give. There's nothing left to kind of, you know, draw strength from as these people are expelled once again and uprooted once again, and they have to find another space where they can be in a tent and to be once again even more vulnerable and more exposed and with less aid than whatever was available 2-3 days ago. So, you know, the dangers that we saw in the past are one thing, but what we have right now is a situation where people who've already been stretched to their limits are enduring what no one can, and with less than what was available just a few months ago. There are no hospitals in Khan Yunis right now where people are being pushed because those hospitals have been destroyed during the ground invasion of that town. There is no infrastructure. It is, you know, some repair work has been done, but nothing to kind of deal with the influx of people that we're going to see. No tents, not enough tents available. Just commuting from Rafah to Khan Yunis will require more money than almost everybody in Rafah has. So it is a nightmare on all levels. And with no aid, it just, you know, you've got all the elements of a perfect storm.
Indeed. HA, our correspondent who's in Deir al-Balah, who had been in Rafah, who's moved, he said that exhaustion and panic define what these families are experiencing, being displaced yet again, some for the 5th or the 6th time. 100,000 people are on the move, but there really is nowhere for them to go, is there? There is no safe zone in Gaza anymore, no matter what Israeli military says.
There is nowhere for them to go. Those are not my words. Those are the words of representatives from a number of aid organizations, the UN. There is no safe zone. Rafah was supposed to be the safe zone. Other areas in the south and center of Gaza were proclaimed to be safe zones. And at every juncture where a particular area was defined as a safe zone, you saw within 24 hours or less those areas being targeted by IDF bombs or missiles or, you know, other weaponry and artillery. So there is no safe zone in Gaza as a whole. The entirety of the Gaza Strip, unfortunately, is not somewhere that we can consider to be a safe zone. There is no particular area that can be considered safe from Israeli fire. And there's not sufficient infrastructure to care for those who are displaced when they get to any of these areas in the first place. One suggestion was Moassi, which is a small area on the coast, which is on sand. I mean, this isn't a place where people can actually live for any period of time. But there wasn't any infrastructure there anyway, so people were being told, "Go there, and you're safe." It wasn't safe, and then on top of that, it also wasn't livable anyway. So unfortunately, this has been a recurring issue for the past 7 months, where the people of Gaza are told, go this way or go that way. But even the routes that they are told to go through, the roads they are ordered to walk on or drive through, they're not safe either. And I think that we're just going to see that, unfortunately, become worse and worse.
Yeah. As we mentioned at the beginning of this program, displacing civilians amounts to a war crime under international law. Salman, Qatar has also called for urgent international action. Who specifically has to step up here and try, at the very least, to do something about this? Does it all come down to the United States?
Well, for sure, it definitely, the onus is on the United States, President Biden. That's why I think he's put his best administration official, Ambassador Bill Burns, into these talks. He's a serious diplomat, and I know he's probably doing his best. But more than that, I think this has to be accompanied by a series of international messages led by the United States, which surely mean that we have to start looking at the supply of weapons, offensive weapons. I note that Secretary Blinken has not received the report, or they've not yet, when it comes to whether human rights, international humanitarian law is being violated in this from his State Department. We need that to come out as quickly as possible. We understand that some bombs are being held back. It's a very small gesture if that's the case. And then you need countries like the United Kingdom and France, those on the Security Council, as well as the European Union, to clearly signal that there will be consequences. There must be no shilling for those who must face international law. That includes the anticipated indictments in the International Criminal Court within the Israeli establishment, as well as, of course, speaking much more openly about the violations themselves and the ICJ ruling. So there is a host of things which now have to be followed through.
Yeah. Nour, just on that ICJ ruling, Human Rights Watch has said Israel is contravening the International Court of Justice's legally binding orders by obstructing the entry of life-saving aid and services into Gaza by taking control of the Rafah Crossing. I mean, this clearly hasn't deterred Israel at this point in time. What will, if anything, and what consequences do you expect them to face?
My expectations of consequences are regrettably low, but I think in order for Israel to change gear, countries need to, especially in Europe, need to re-examine and realign their rhetoric with their actions. And at the moment, the gap between EU policies as they're expressed verbally and EU policies as they're practiced when it comes to Palestine and Israel is huge, almost insurmountable. And I think Joseph Borrell, their chief diplomat, has spoken about that at length, but he seems to be the only, voice in the desert at this point. Europe can yield a lot of influence, but it has to divide that pressure, not to yield it not just on Israel, but also on the United States, because the Biden administration so far has shown us that it will continue to push those red lines until they mean nothing. Continue to find a way to give Netanyahu a way out, and they need to feel that it will become increasingly difficult for them to have allies standing with them on what Israel is doing in Gaza. And I think that could potentially help Biden make right decisions, because at the moment he's defying the base of his party, he's defying the voters, he's defying his public opinion, as are governments in Europe and in the UK.
Yeah, I want to talk about Egypt now, because obviously the Rafah Crossing is there's agreements between many people, but Egypt is involved in each and every one of them. HA, we saw a video that was filmed by Israeli soldiers, basically showing tanks driving around the border crossing after they took control, knocking over a sign with Gaza on it and waving very large Israeli flags. How much of a provocation is that towards Egypt, do you think?
So I'll answer your question, but before I do, just to emphasize this point about leverage and the changing of Israel's behavior. The United States is the most crucial actor in this regard by far. The European Union is split on this. There have been some very good statements from different member states, Ireland, Spain, Belgium, and of course, Joseph Borrell, as your guest mentioned. But Israel will not pay attention unless pressure comes from the United States. There has been no pressure. There's been rhetoric. There's been rhetoric for the past 7 months, with the exception of very few things over the last few days. But otherwise, it's been rhetoric. It's been pressure. And that means that there's a responsibility on particularly the United Kingdom and France, as Salman mentioned, but to put pressure on the United States and to make it clear that as American allies, they see this very differently and are pushing very differently. And unfortunately, that hasn't really taken place, particularly in London, but also in Paris. And we will not see any change in Israeli behavior unless it comes from the United States in terms of actual pressure and leverage. Now, with regards to your question, of course, the Egyptians are very concerned when it comes to not just the provocations, but also the mere presence of the IDF, especially with that sort of weaponry and artillery in the Philadelphia corridor, in Rafah, so close to the border. I'm not sure if the provocation was aimed at the Egyptians or more at Hamas and the people of Rafah, but it doesn't really matter. You have Israeli tanks literally going up and down the border. And this has been something that the Egyptians have been expressing publicly great opposition just to the very notion of for the past 7 months. But having said that, again, this is down to external powers that do have leverage over Israel, not actually putting their money where their mouths are. We had suggestions early on in the few weeks right after October 7th that Palestinians in Gaza could, quote unquote, temporarily go to Sinai. And it was only after Cairo expressed such vehement opposition to the idea of this, quote unquote, voluntary ethnic cleansing that the idea was dropped as a subject of discussion by Western powers. But this has continued within Israel. It has continued within the cabinet. It has continued within not just the far right of Israeli politics, but the center and the center right of Israeli politics. That's what we're looking at right now. And I think that everybody is concerned on the Egyptian side that the Israelis are thinking, well, maybe it's time we could do it.
Salman, just on that point, as HA was talking about there, the Egyptians have been vehemently opposed to letting Palestinians be forcibly displaced into the Sinai Peninsula. But if this operation does expand in Rafah, how real a possibility is that of happening, and what do you think Egypt would be forced to do to stop it?
Well, as we stand today, I think there is a possibility that can happen. And of course, Egypt has to respond in the starkest way. It has to signal that it cannot be business as usual with Israel anymore. It has to signal, as it has, I think, obliquely already, with regards to its own peace agreement. And of course, let's put Jordan in the mix here as well. This is the other country. The Jordanian foreign minister has also been very outspoken in this regard. These are the two countries which have long-standing peace agreements with Israel. And those will have to be, I would have thought, looked at. There's also a responsibility for some of the other Arab states, including the Abraham Accord countries. I note that the United Arab Emirates has produced a very strong statement as well, as has Saudi Arabia, which of course is key, but not a member of the Abraham Accords. So this Arab pressure has to be brought to bear, led by Egypt and Jordan, in my view, as well, especially because it affects Egypt so openly, and it would be an absolute disaster for them. But I fear that even this is not going to be enough. I think Hisham H.A. is absolutely right, that without the United States taking a very strong position now, and it can, we are in real danger of this rolling into the Sinai.
Nour, do you think that Israel actually wants to hold the Rafah Crossing long term, and what are the consequences if it does?
I think Israel does want to hold the Rafah Crossing long term, and I think it's become very clear that the long-term plan for Gaza, as far as Netanyahu is concerned and his coalition are concerned, is to stay in Gaza and to continue occupying it. And there will always be an excuse pushed forward and perhaps endorsed by the Americans about this. But, even if you go back to the beginning of the, occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967, it was set to be temporary. And then you had settlements. And then all of a sudden you had to have the army there to protect the settlements, which are a war crime. And then there was another thing introduced about, the land being too thin and Arab countries being too close by, and so we can't have a Palestinian state, and so on and so forth. There is always a way that Israel advances its agenda of permanent occupation, permanent colonization, and permanent, control over the Palestinians, not just their political rights and their right to be in a country of their own, but how they live and in what way they can enjoy that life or not. And in Gaza, that has always taken on an extreme dimension. Keeping control of Rafah means that Israel will decide who can stay, who can leave, how long would it take, when that crossing would be operational, long before or long after the war is done. I lived in Gaza for many years, and it was a nightmare. Just thinking about whether the crossing is open or not, and how you can plan travels, and whether you can have commitments, and so on and so forth. That having that control, that foreign control over you, changes the way you think about your life and changes the way society thinks about its horizon and the opportunities available to it. And it's just one more way to keep the boot, if you will, on their neck.
Thank you so much. We will have to leave it there, but we really do appreciate all of your time and your insight into this. Salman, Nour and HA, we really do appreciate it. Thank you. Well, thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Tom McRae, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.